Hey everyone, it's Allie, and let's talk about our mana stacking Kinetic Blast Whisper. Now, this is going to be the last update that we're going to do for the build. While I would have loved to play into the endgame, honestly, it's only a 1 month long event, and I feel like the position that we're going to be putting this build at, with all the gear that we're going to be discussing in this video, is honestly going to be more than enough for you to be able to basically do all contents and maybe even be able to do T17s somewhat comfortably. And with that, I kind of want to move on and play other builds and just enjoy a bunch of different things for the limited time that we have to enjoy the event rather than to specifically stick to one build. While I typically like specifically focusing on one build and min-maxing as much as I can, I feel like this event's a little bit of a different case where it's probably better to spread out and try a bunch of different things. So with that said, we have learned quite a lot about this build over the past few days, and honestly, I am pretty happy where we're going to leave the build off. With the addition of Svalinn, which we'll be discussing here in a little bit, we can basically tank anything we want, and if we just keep upgrading our gear a little bit more, we can very easily hit about 10,000 mana or so. And with Svalinn and our decent single target DPS at that point, you should pretty much be able to do whatever content that you want to. I was able to do pinnacles just fine, basically sitting in every ability and limit testing to just see just how tinky we were. And given that at the time of me doing these pinnacle bosses, I had about 6 to 7 div worth of gear plus this Svalinn, I'd say everything felt pretty good. Now, one thing I want to go over before we discuss all the things that we're going to be changing about the build is Indigon. Now, unfortunately, Indigon just does not work with a Wander. Indigon in general just straight up doesn't work with anything other than specifically Manifold Arrows because we don't have a way to deramp. I don't want to get too into the mud when it comes to how exactly Indigon works, but the point is we don't have a way to leech mana back up while we're waiting for a second Arcane Cloak ramp to start, and it's not something we could really ever get a hold of, given we don't have something like Stormrated Conduit, which Manifold Arrows does, which allows you to leech while you're deramping, allowing you to be able to get your mana back up to full. The other issue as well is, unfortunately, even with the sheer amount of hits that Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation generates, which is substantially higher than what KB would offer you on bosses, it's still nowhere enough mana sustain to actually be able to deal with Indigon and deal with an even scuffed pre-ramp, which unfortunately kind of just makes everything really, really clunky to play. Because of this, it just really is impossible to put an Indigon in this build, and I really didn't think that this was going to be an issue. I completely overlooked this being a problem, and yeah, it kind of sucks that we don't get Indigon, but honestly, I'm not too sad about it because the build without Indigon turned out to be pretty good. If I were to take the 30 div that I put into Indigon and just spend on my gear, because I was literally playing with day 1 gear while doing Guardians, and the only thing I really purchased was a Svalinn and a few other items here and there on day 2. If I just took that 30 div and put it into actual gear with Svalinn on top of it, honestly, I'd have a really great time and I'd be able to kill Guardians within maybe a few seconds at most, and honestly, everything would feel pretty comfy and I'd have a pretty good time with it. So even with the win again, I think the mid-game of the build is pretty good overall. With all that said, let's actually discuss the upgrades for the build, how you can make it better, and how to improve it from the early game setup. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do in the build is we're going to want to look for 3 core items. We're going to want to get ourselves Healthy Mind, and what you ideally want to do with it is you want to put it in this socket right here, and this will turn Herbalism as well as Intuition into percent mana nodes, giving you quite a large boost of mana out of thin air. This honestly isn't worth that much, especially now that we're a few days past league launch, given that the market has cooled off a little bit. So you would want to make this as a upgrade pretty early on to your build, given it's, well, somewhere around 1 to 1,500 mana, depending on how far along you are with your build. The other 2 core upgrades you're going to want to immediately make is going to be to upgrade your Deodres to an actual pair of gloves. What we're really looking for here is just attack speed, dex, mana, and a little bit of resistances if you can, a little bit of life if you can, and outside of that, an open prefix for increased damage while leeching would be nice, or anything like that. At this price point, they really aren't worth crafting on our own, as crafting them is going to be more expensive than just buying a pair. We would also ideally want to put Lightning Exposure on the gloves as an Eldritch Implicit, along with Intimidate. Once you put Lightning Exposure on the gloves, you can then drop your Wave of Conviction completely, as it will be completely useless, and, well, you just get an open jewel socket back. For your amulets, you're going to also want to do the same thing, where we want to get rid of Carnage Heart and instead replace it with just, well, anything else. It's pretty easy to beat Carnage Heart, and all we're going to be doing to find ourselves a new amulet is we're going to be using the trade for these items feature in Path of Building to generate a list of mods that are going to give us a DPS increase, and then we're just simply going to open up the trade link and just use the sum button to find a decent amulet. The thing about this is that your Carnage Heart is going to have attributes on it that is most likely keeping you afloat in terms of your intelligence, and you most likely are res cap because of it. So you might have to keep that in mind, and you might have to replace your other gear first to make sure you can drop your Carnage Heart, Or what you could do is add an extra filter onto the weighted sum that Path of Billion generates you with something like intelligence or res or whatever you need to be able to actually replace your card chart with a new amulet. Again, you still want to keep Prological Perfection on here as a dirt cheap enchant, and it's a 16% DPS increase. After you do all of that, another thing you want to consider now is for you to automate your Sniper's Mark to get some better clearing. Our goal here is going to be to basically completely get rid of Arcanist Brand by removing Weight of Conviction through the Exposure Gloves, and then for us to run a mark on hit for a Sniper's Mark. But the thing about that is that you need to be above 0% mark effect, which Sniper's Mark gives you 16% reduced when you have it qualityed, because if you don't, the 2 splits on Sniper's Mark get reduced down to 1, which drastically reduces your single target damage. The way for us to remedy this is we are going to just pick up Expert Hunter. This gives you 36% total mark effect, and at the same time, this allows us to drop Blood Rage because the Mark Mastery gives us frenzies on hit, meaning you don't have to press Blood Rage anymore, you don't have to deal with the degen of Blood Rage anymore, and you'll randomly get Sniper's Marks on rares throughout your maps, make your clear be stronger while at the same time removing even more buttons from the build. What you could do as an upgrade to that later, and you could do this literally whenever you have enough money to afford it, is you want to grab yourself 7 Tattoo of the Thessalio Scouts, which give you 4% increased mark effect each. And when paired with a 20/20 mark on hit, you will get over the 50% increased mark effect hump, which will then give you 3 projectiles on your Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation instead of 2. In Path of Building, on your Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation, you should be setting it to a count of 12, but with these 7 mark effect tattoos, we can then set it to 17, given we get additional splits per Kinetic Bolt that we do, which is a pretty large DPS increase. Once you've done all of that, what I'd next recommend for you to do is to go and look for other good items in all of your other slots. For example, if you don't have a good chestplate, you should look for a decent chestplate with some life, some dex, and some mana on it. If you don't have good rings, you should look for rings as well. Same thing, you just need life, dex, mana. There's nothing else that you really want here. You can potentially look for added lightning damage as a craft if possible, but it's not needed. What we're then going to want to do from there is think about purchasing our first major mid-game upgrade. In this case, we're going to then be looking for a Svalinn because this shield will literally take your build from feeling kind of squishy to basically never dying ever again. Now, you can still die with Svalinn as it is not a 100% impenetrable defense, but you will very clearly notice just how much easier the game is going to be once you do get yourself the shield. What makes it so good is the lucky block on it. This allows you to very easily get to about 80% attack block and 80% spell block with very minimal investment in block, which, well, with 80/80, we just ignore 4/5 of all attacks that happen against us. This shield allowed me to go from feeling kind of tinky in T16s to being able to basically AFK in the middle of an invitation and not really worry about dying. Now, because we're only blocking 80% of attacks, there is a 20% chance an attack would come through, and well, if that attack was a really, really big attack that would have one-shot you, it's still going to one-shot you, so you might still have a random death here and there, especially if you randomly get crit at the same time or if a map has really bad modifiers on it, but realistically, it's going to make everything feel substantially better than before. Once you get yourself Svalinn, all you have to do is simply just pick up Deflection, Testudo, and Versatile Combatant on the passive tree along with their 2 masteries, and this just puts you at 80% attack block and 79% spell block. On top of this, we are going to also want to run a Reckless Defense. Sure, it's going to make our chance to get crit a lot higher, but the amount of additional spell block that this gives us is pretty crucial to making everything feel really comfy. You could potentially skip on Reckless Defense and just be okay with just the passive points and nothing else, but I would recommend to look for Reckless as well, as it does actually feel pretty nice to use on top of everything else. Finally, the other thing that we want to look for around this time, you can either get this before Svalinn or after Svalinn, would then be to potentially look for a Brutal Restraint. This Timeless Jewel is going to give us 2 dexterity on every single small passive point within the big circle that it applies, while at the same time giving you some additional stats on all the big notables within its radius. In this case, we want to put it over here by where Iron Will used to be. Because those turns keystones into other things, we can't take Iron Will anymore, but over here, it's going to give us quite a lot of additional dexterity while giving us 3 nodes to potentially find some decent stats on. All you have to do to find yourself a Brutal Restraint is, well, pretty easy. At the bottom of Path of Building, you're going to click Find Timeless Jewel. Here, we're then going to set it to whatever we want. In this case, we want a Brutal Restraint. We're going to leave the Conqueror as any because we don't care about what happens to keystones. We're then choose Iron Will as our socket. We're going to click Filter Notables, so it only looks at the nodes that we currently have selected. And then all we're going to do is click on Sort by Combined DPS in the Fallback Weighting mode, and then click Generate. In the Fallback Node section, it's now going to generate a weighting for all of the stats that are going to be useful to you. We then set it to Phrecia, and then we simply hit search. This then is going to show you all of the different brutal restraints and is going to organize them in terms of the single best one possible for your build at the top. And then from there, well, they're only going to get worse and worse and worse. All you have to do from there is simply click copy trade URL, and then you simply open up your browser and then just simply paste the trade URL in there and see if anything shows up. Now, the ones at the top are really good and they're most likely going to be immediately bought out. They're likely not going to find anything. All you do is simply click copy next trade URL and just paste the next one in here. And you simply will just do this until you find a timeless tool up for sale. This might take you quite a bit to do, unfortunately, as there does seem to be quite a lack of timeless tools available on the trade right now. But as we can see, we did find 2 after a 4th attempt, and we found 1559 and 3979. What we can then do is scroll down to them, and we can see 1559 would give us dexterity on 4th on Shaper, as well as 5% global accuracy rating on Constitution. In the case of 3979, this will give us dexterity on both Forethought and Shaper. Now, if these end up being 20, 30 div or something, you don't have to go and buy them. You can simply just click copy next trade URL and just simply keep going through these until you find one that is affordable for you, that has some nodes on it that you're happy with. This might take you a little bit to do, but honestly, it's not that bad given how large of a DPS increase Brutal Restraint is. This can later be paired up with Unnatural Instinct in the slot right below it, meaning that every single one of these small nodes can give you another 4 dexterity, which, well, is going to give you quite a lot of extra stats. At the same time, you do get yourself a little bit more block chance, so getting your Svalinn set up is even easier. Now, Unnatural Instinct is going to be a little bit expensive. You don't need to set up a Brutal Restraint immediately, but it is nice to get as an upgrade afterwards. From there, all you realistically would have left to do in the build would be for you to just keep upgrading your gear, where you're looking for better and better rolls on all of your gear in terms of getting more dexterity, more mana, more life. Ideally, you'd eventually want to upgrade your rings over to Cerulean rings as they give you % mana. From there, you'd potentially want to be interested in getting yourself Awakened jewels, and at some point, you might want to start considering potentially going for something like a Mage Blood or a Nimbus or some sort of other high-end items. I genuinely believe if you put about 30 to 35 div into this build and get yourself a Svalinn, you can very easily then do pretty much whatever content you want to outside of tier 17s. Although you probably can do T17s, they might just feel a little bit bad as your boss damage isn't going to be high enough to kill the bosses quickly, especially if they have some really nasty modifiers on them. But you could very easily just keep farming from there to get yourself any of the high-end items if you want to keep pushing the build further. I really had a lot of fun in this build, and I had a pretty good time with it, and I really enjoyed the league start with it. The thing with our damage was a little bit lackluster, unfortunately, but the clear was great, and honestly, I had a pretty fun time progressing all the way up until endgame with this. If you have any questions on anything we discussed here, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I'm excited to bring you kitties a new build within a few days, as I think the next build we're going to be playing after this one is going to be a banger that I think a lot of people are going to be interested in, given from just me leveling the build and us starting to test it in the end game. It's been feeling pretty damn fun so far, and well, like I said, I think a lot of people are going to enjoy it. With that said, kitties, I hope you enjoyed playing Kinetic Blast along with me. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all in the next video.